The Curse of Willowbrook. I felt excited as I drove out of the city in my trusty old sedan toward what felt like the most important moment of my life. The job interview, the one that could change everything. I had meticulously planned every detail, from the black blazer I wore to the polished shoes that clicked with each step I took. For weeks I had prepared, researching the company, rehearsing answers to interview questions, and choosing the perfect outfit that radiated professionalism and confidence. HR had emailed me directions to the company's headquarters across state. I had printed them out and committed every turn and every exit to memory. But as I took the designated exit on the highway, a gnawing unease began to claw at the edges of my mind. I double-checked the crumpled paper of directions as my phone's GPS chimed in to stubbornly insist I was on the right path. But the view out of my car told a different story. The cityscape I was expecting had given way to an unfamiliar country road. The anxiety grew with each mile that stretched out before me. Time was running out, and I couldn't afford to be late. But as I drove further into the unknown, I couldn't ignore the fact that something had gone terribly wrong. My knuckles whitened as they tightened around the steering wheel, and I felt the weight of impending disaster bearing down on me, like an invisible force trying to derail my carefully laid plans. The road stretched on, leading me deeper into a desolate countryside that bore no resemblance to the city I had left. And that's when I saw it, a rusted sign at the side of the road, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. It simply said, "Welcome to Willowbrook." It wasn't a place I had ever heard of before. It certainly wasn't on the list of towns along the route I planned, and my GPS remained infuriatingly silent about the apparent diversion. I hesitated by the sign. I had no phone reception, and I was unsure what I should do. I could turn back, but the temptation of the job and the promise of financial stability urged me to keep going and try asking for directions in Willowbrook. The car seemed to make the decision for me, sputtering to a halt with a clunk. Panic surged within me as I frantically tried to restart the engine, but my constant pumping on the accelerator only managed to flood it and ultimately make it harder to start. I cursed my bad luck. I wouldn't be driving anywhere for a while. Stranded alone, on an isolated road with no idea where I was, I decided to venture into the town that the sign had promised. Gathering my purse and folder filled with resumes, I stepped out of the car. The countryside stretched out around me, eerily quiet and still. The fading daylight painted the landscape in shades of gray and shadow, but a little further down the road, I could see buildings that must have been Willowbrook. Determined to find someone who could give me some help or directions back to the city, I began walking along the deserted road, my purse held tightly at my side. Willowbrook was a quaint town that appeared to be frozen in the 1950s. The architecture was old-fashioned and decorated in retro styles, complete with posters for products I don't think they make anymore. It was as if I had stepped into a bygone era, a place untouched by the passage of time. My footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets as I ventured further into the heart of Willowbrook. I turned off of the main street, but I couldn't find a single person anywhere. I called out, my voice ringing through the eerie silence, but there was no response. The windows of the quaint houses remained dark, and the streets were utterly deserted. As the last light of day faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the empty windows held unseen eyes. My heart quickened, and I began to walk faster. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could help me out of this strange, silent town. Then I heard people. I turned in the direction of the voices. A few residents had appeared on the road behind me, where they stood eerily stiff. Their eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. They were chattering to one another, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like they were talking in another language I couldn't understand. The promise of a dream job was now a distant memory. I just wanted to leave. My head facing down, to avoid eye contact, I made to go back to my parked car. But as I tried to slip past them, one of the residents sidestepped to block my path. I looked up to see a woman with porcelain skin and jet black hair that cascaded like a dark waterfall down her shoulders. "Hello there," she said, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. "We haven't seen you around here before?" "I'm just passing through," I replied. Her lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but her eyes held a predatory gleam. "Sorry if we alarmed you," she continued. "Folk in Willowbrook are just a bit different." I returned an insincere smile and a nod before I turned to leave, but she reached out and grabbed me by the wrist. "What's your hurry? Things don't get interesting around here until after dark." She added her words, dripping with an unsettling mixture of allure and foreboding. Then she began to change. As I stood frozen in horror, her porcelain skin seemed to take on an otherworldly pallor in the moonlight. The predatory glint in her eyes intensified, and her grip on my wrist tightened, her fingers digging into my flesh like icy talons. Her once alluring features distorted horrifically as they dissolved into a grotesque mask of malice, her mouth stretching impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. A guttural, inhuman growl escaped her as her body convulsed, bones snapping and flesh writhing in the nightmarish transformation. I watched in sheer terror as the woman, or what had once been a woman, became a hideous monster right before my eyes. I kicked out at her and managed to break free from her grasp, falling backwards onto the ground. The folder I had been carrying went flying up into the air to send a cascading shower of documents in all directions. I realized then that the other residents had also changed into monstrous mockeries of the human form. Their contorted faces hungrily grinned at me, their torn lips parting to reveal sharp, glistening teeth. I screamed and ran, the malevolent residents giving chase behind me. I had never been much of a fighter, but several years of track and field had made me fast. I was gradually widening the distance from my pursuers when the heel of one of my shoes, meant more for a professional office environment than the 100-yard sprint, broke off. I fell to the ground, tearing my skirt and grazing my legs. I threw myself upright and forced my legs to keep working despite the pain that flared in my knees. But the best I could do was a brisk jog. I rounded a corner and saw a narrow alleyway between two buildings. While I was out of their line of sight, I quickly stumbled inside to hide behind a large dumpster. My breath came in ragged gasps, so I put my hand across my mouth to try to muffle the sound of my heavy breathing. I heard them coming, hollering and growling, louder and louder, as they reached the opening of the alleyway in which I hid. My back pressed against the cold, damp bricks of the alley wall. I tightly closed my eyes. I wished to become small, so small that the monsters of Willowbrook couldn't find me. Eventually, their animalistic noises became fainter and fainter as they ran further away in search of where I had gone. I opened my eyes and tried to take stock of my situation, but it just seemed too unbelievable, too crazy. But I had to do something. I still had my purse, so I opened it and looked for something that might help. I took out my phone, but there was still no signal, so I put it back. I took out my car keys and a heavy perfume bottle, considering to use them as weapons. I'd accidentally squirted myself in the eyes a few times, and it had stung like crazy. They weren't much, but they were all I had, so they would have to be enough. The alleyway ended in a dead end, so I went back the way I had come in. Hesitantly, I peeked out into the street, first right, then left. I couldn't see anyone or anything, so I slowly crept back out into the street and carefully went in the direction I had left my car. My makeshift weapons a reassuring presence in my trembling hands. Suddenly, a howl shattered the silence of the chilling night. I span to see one of the monsters had turned a corner and caught sight of me. It charged, dropping to all fours to gallop towards me like a four-legged beast. Key ready to scratch and perfume ready to spray, I steeled myself for the confrontation. but as it got close enough for me to see the drool dripping from its jagged fangs, I had a sudden change of heart. With a guttural cry, I swung the hefty perfume bottle with all my strength, striking it full in the face. It yelped like a wounded dog, its inhuman features contorted in pain as it tumbled wildly off course to smash through a shop window to my left. Without waiting to see what happened next, I ran for all I was worth. As I did, I heard the howls of more monsters joining the chase. I didn't dare turn back to see how many were on my tail. Then I spotted a familiar landmark, the weathered sign that had welcomed me to Willowbrook, and below it was my beautiful old sedan. The realization that escape was just within reach filled me with a surge of adrenaline, and I pushed myself on even harder. Just as I reached the car, my trembling fingers fumbled with the keys. Then, a searing pain speared my ankle, and I was thrown sprawling to the ground. I looked down to see the gnashing jaws of whatever it was had clamped onto my leg. So I let fly with savage kicks until it finally released its grip on me. I scrambled to my feet, pain radiating from my injured limb, and wasted no time. I swung the car door open and tumbled inside, locking the doors and inserted the key into the ignition with a trembling hand. Then they were upon me. Maybe about half a dozen twisted, horrific abominations started pounding against the car with ferocious strength. The passenger side window smashed, showering me with sharp beads of broken glass that cut my face as the engine finally roared to life. Tires spinning in the dirt, the car jerked backwards and away from my attacker's grasp. Then, with a guttural scream of defiance, I shifted into drive and floored the accelerator. The car surged forward, racing toward where they had gathered around my car. Now it was their turn to try to run. I felt the thud as the front of the car collided with 2 or 3 of the creatures, followed by a sickening crunch as I drove over them. Then, with the screech of rubber on asphalt, I spanned the car around and sped away in the direction I had come. I drove and didn't stop until I reached the safety of the city and the sun had risen. As the rush of adrenaline began to ebb, I became acutely aware of the throbbing pain that radiated up my ankle. I shifted uncomfortably in the driver's seat, my fingers tracing the area where the jagged teeth had punctured my flesh. The wound was gruesome, a mess of torn flesh and oozing blood that I couldn't bear to look at. I made my way to the nearest hospital where they treated me for a dog bite. I told them my story, but they didn't believe me. I told it to the police officer they called too, but he had never heard of Willowbrook. No one had. I tried to show them where it was, but I was never able to find it again. In the end, my account was written off as the ramblings of a scared girl that got lost on the back roads at night. I don't blame them, not really. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But if you ever find yourself lost on the back roads, if you see that rusted sign with the words, "Welcome to Willowbrook," please listen, stop and turn back while you still can.